This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living Catholic, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma. This is Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor of Sacred Heart Parish and rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother. Recently, I went to see the movie Cabrini. I thought I'd share some thoughts about it with you. It's not often a made-for-the-theater movie comes out about the life of a great saint, and when it does, it deserves some attention. And I'm happy to report it had mine. In fact, I guess it still does, since I'm still talking about it. So I guess one of the things it is important for what might come about the lives of other saints. And I guess we could begin with the fact of the name of the movie. Cabrini is a bit daring, since if you're not a Catholic, you probably have no idea what the movie would be about and why it would have such an obscure title. The filmmakers could have chosen something more compelling, like, I don't know, Forgotten Virtue or The Woman in the City or something like that. At least such a title might bring someone to watch it who had some measure of interest in such things. But they didn't do that. They stuck with the focus on the main character. And it seems to have paid off. Now, the folks making the movie come from the same studio that produced The Sound of Freedom. In the landscape of big-time filmmaking, this was a project, apparently, The Sound of Freedom, that nobody wanted to touch. It's about child trafficking and is based on a true story of a federal agent who quit his job in order to continue investigating and then putting in jail some of the major figures involved in the crimes. Over the course of last year, it became a major hit. The big studios weren't interested in the project, and there wasn't a lot of premium money available for it. Faced with being locked out of the normal channels of the movie business, the producers opted for an alternative means of getting it made. It's that same spirit of can-do, innovative filmmaking that permeates the Cabrini project as well. I don't think Hollywood is allergic to movies about child trafficking because they're steeped in pedophilia, as some people claim. Now, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of awful people in the major studios who no doubt are involved in all of the vice anyone anywhere could entangle themselves with, including child sexual abuse and exploitation. And given some of the recent revelations about studio activities that have recently been uncovered and reported on, all of which share the characteristic that they were well known by everyone in the entertainment and news industries, but were never investigated and never written about and never brought to the public eye. Such things may be more present in Hollywood than in other places. But that's not the reason the major studios have stayed away from producing a project like The Sound of Freedom or Cabrini. It's because they don't think it's what people want to watch. As Samuel Goldwyn said, if you have a message, call Western Union. Hollywood thinks there is no audience for this kind of message being sent. Well, at least for not this particular kind of message about a great saint. A movie like Cabrini isn't common fare for modern studios. In the past, it wasn't so. Plenty of films were made about the men of faith. There was the Rock Hudson movie Battle Hymn about a minister who was called back into service as a fighter pilot in the Korean War. Bing Crosby was in The Bells of St. Mary and Going My Way, and it was a big hit. So were A Man for All Seasons, I Confess, and The Cardinal, all made according to the regular Hollywood formula. And that formula is, in case you don't know, to make a movie that people will pay to go see. We can complain that Hollywood has lost its way, but in the end, what they're committed to is making money. They're convinced they can't if they're faced with a project like this one. It falls to smaller studios that are willing to take a shot, and it looks like this small studio succeeded. Cabrini is a film about the life and ministry of Mother Frances Xavier Cabrini, an Italian nun sent by the Pope to respond to the dire conditions of the Italian immigrants newly arrived in New York City. She'd wanted to respond to the whirlwind of excitement stirring at the time to bring the gospel to China. Cabrini's ideal was to be a part of that movement. And to this end, she founded the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which comprised a total of 7 nuns, including herself, in Lodi, Italy in 1880. Because of her health problems and her lack of resources, she was eventually denied approval to go to China, but was sent instead to the United States. She arrived in 1889 at the height of the Italian wave of immigration and began her work in New York City. Confronting the huge problems of immigrant poverty, disconnection from the normal intersections of support and identity, the anonymity of urban living, and the brutal working and living conditions of the time, which were all compounded by the indifference and the hostility on the part of the native population of the time, the Italian community that she found was in desperate shape. While coming to America was regarded by many of those who came as a dream come true, it became a nightmare quickly for many. And that's the first accomplishment of this film, a quick look at an unknown part of the American story, because immigrant life for virtually everyone was difficult. For some of the communities that established themselves in the golden age of American immigration, from the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, and they were quote-unquote golden only because it is the immigrant wave most often spoken of and celebrated by most Americans, for many of them, their experience was ghastly. It was so difficult for the Italian community, in fact, that large numbers of those who arrived from the poverty of southern Italy returned home as quickly as they could. The outflow of Italians from the U.S. back to Italy in many years often dwarfed the numbers of those Italians coming to the U.S. That's an aspect of the American dream we never hear about. Cabrini helps to pull the curtain back on the reality our ancestors experienced but never mentioned. So, score one for the movie makers. The film also reveals a bit of the harshness of life evident during America's golden age. It was the time when some of the great fortunes were being accumulated and when the great cities were being built and when the common outlines of social expectations were being established. In many ways, this was the time when what it meant to be an American was being defined. And while we look back at this moment in our history as generally pacific and not affected by currents of international political life, it was not so for those who experienced it, whether they were native-born or immigrant. The country was emerging from the catastrophe of the Civil War. It was also facing the closing of the West and the truth of the ghastly, wasteful exploitation and ruination of natural resources, both human and material. And it was trying to define itself as a society in which huge numbers of people shared neither a common language nor a common culture. No one knew exactly what to make of what the country was or what it would become. And Mother Cabrini entered this maelstrom and added her voice to the conversation. As immigrants, with no roots in the society and with no participation in the public square, the Italians had no place at the table of decision-making and so were therefore by turns exploitable and useful. Her insistence on the dignity of the Italians who came to New York at this time is the focus of the movie. The drama begins as she arrives and then continues throughout the film as she understands what her people are facing and what she can do about it. One strong feature of the movie was how much of the dialogue, both in Italy and in New York, was in Italian. It gives us, the viewers, a real sense of the distance separating the immigrants from the rest of society, as well as a feeling of the foreignness of the time from our own. In fact, one of the most pleasing aspects of the dramatic arc is the power Cabrini accumulates as she wakes up to the political realities of the time and realizes how her willingness to be present and minister to the people in her charge wedges their concerns into active civil engagement. Mother was able to combine her desire to serve her people in their need, along with her realization that their long-term welfare depended on changing the city of New York. And she was successful in both areas. We're led to focus in succession on the many faceted aspects of Cabrini's ministry. This allows us to appreciate her intelligence and energy as she goes about exploring her options in her environment. As the film unfolds its storytelling, we see the gritty life the immigrants face, the exploitation they suffer, both at the hands of the surrounding culture as well as by their own people, and then the hope that Cabrini's ministry offers to them. As we move from one layer of experience to the other and then from one solution to the other, these build on one another. More than anything else, we get a glimpse of the intricacy of urban ministry as well as her insight that to serve is to simplify both the understanding as well as the options available to those who care, which is one of the strengths of the movie. And more than anything else, we're offered a chance to see the genius of true service, not just in dedication and hard work, but from the perspective of someone who sees something more. That is, we're allowed to see this rough world through the eyes of someone who takes Jesus' imprecation that as you served them, you served me seriously. In all of the details of her work, Mother Cabrini didn't go about building a political base or constructing a giant institutional structure. What she tried to do was to serve the people in need. Her solutions ended up becoming an empire of interconnected institutions and a web of political opportunities, but only because they were first effective at addressing those who were in need. The most powerful side story is Mother Cabrini's ability to navigate these challenges in a world that dismissed her efforts because of her sex. The church of the day and the society at large was dominated in its official decision-making by men. From prime ministers and mayors to popes and pastors, Cabrini had to thread her way through the labyrinth of blindness and indifference caused by and prompted by men. Above all, she had to establish her bona fides to men who held their office with no understanding of the problems she faced or the opportunities she identified. Over and over, she was not only misunderstood, but also underestimated. Much of the arc of the movie is dedicated to describing the sexism of the time and her latent ability to pierce the curtain of ignorance and dismissiveness that was so evident there. This is probably the most compelling and identifiable theme throughout the movie. There's nothing more attractive to our sensibilities than to see a strong woman in difficult circumstances conquer the innate unfairness of the times and come out ahead. And given our awareness of the blindness of sexism and the foolishness of our ancestors' point of view, we all cheer when we review the successes of such a woman as Mother Cabrini in the face of those who simply didn't understand or appreciate her abilities. The most celebrated line of the whole movie is at the very end when she's in earnest discussion with the mayor of New York City. He tries to compliment her by noting that if she were a man, she would have truly been a dominating character. And her response is part of the movie's trailer, since it makes the movie compelling and attractive for us. She says that no man could have done what she did. We, in our time, love such lessons. The movie celebrates her insight and dedication. It honors her initiative and her understanding, and it flatters us because we in our age believe we stand on her side against the foolishness and limitations of the patriarchy so evident at the time. While celebrating this brave and misunderstood woman, we all get to feel good about our superior points of view. The producers knew this kind of stroking of our collective cultural ego would be as attractive to men as to women, and thus the movie has been a success. Popes and mayors do take a significant hit in the movie, and rightly so. They were limited and narrow, according to the experience and the expectations of the times. Cardinals and clerics and politicians of all stripes and backgrounds, all of them at the time men, are universal in their dismissiveness and their incomprehension of what gifts Cabrini could bring to the ministry of the church. And for the most part, they all come off as buffoonish. This is especially true of the pastor of the Italian parish where Mother Cabrini set up shop, and of the bishop of New York City, who seemed to have stood in her way over and over. If you wanted both a snapshot of clerical indolence as well as a view of institutional blindness, the movie spells it out in large letters. Look no farther than the Catholic Church of New York City in the age of Mother Cabrini's arrival and subsequent ministry in her newly adopted place. We all shake our heads at their foolishness then. Although, as in every movie, we're asked to cheer our hero at the expense of her enemies. When Mother talks to the Bishop of New York or to the Italian pastor at the parish where her orphanage was founded, we're on her side, not on theirs. And it's fine. A movie can't have everything in it or it'd be 10 hours long. But in every exchange, the movie makers take her side, and we're invited to dismiss the concerns of those other people. The pastor of the Italian parish had to think about all of the threats and difficulties of the environment, not only the orphans that Mother Cabrini was taking care of. He comes across in the movie as vacillating and impotent. Perhaps he was, but perhaps he also had more concerns and cares than she. And can I say it? Mother Cabrini was protected by her sex as much as endangered by it. A man in a collar faced concerns a woman in a habit didn't face. This was as true in New York City in the 1890s as it was in Central America in the 1980s. For example, in the midst of the civil wars raging in Salvador and Guatemala at that time in the 1980s, an archbishop, a group of Jesuit professors, and dozens of priests were murdered at their altars and in their homes. At the same time, sisters who worked directly in the areas with the greatest insurgency and the most revolutionary activity were not killed. For example, the Carmelite missionary sisters of St. Teresa were present when Archbishop St. Oscar Romero was murdered at his altar and when Blessed Stanley Rother was shot in his bedroom. In neither case were the sisters harmed. In 1986, when I drove from San Salvador to Guatemala City during the height of the civil wars in both countries, I felt protected since I was driving with one of the sisters. Something of this was also present in the life and the ministry of Mother Cabrini. Suffice it to say that the situation in New York City, as in Central America, when it came to clerics and sisters, was more complicated than the simple contrast between brave sisters and quivering clerics. A lot more complicated. And we also have to note the definitions of contemporary feminism and girl power are not adequate to the situation Mother Cabrini found herself in. Yes, she did not have access to the power of the papacy or the cachet of the cardinals. And yes, when she arrived in New York City, women did not have the right to vote and were not directly engaged in the civil life of governance or the ecclesial hierarchy of the church. In many ways today, we can look back at these arrangements with a critical eye, but Mother Cabrini was not exactly crushed by the arrangements of the day. She founded her orphanages, she built hospitals, she eventually founded and staffed and ran hundreds of institutions on 4 continents. This was all accomplished by a woman who had founded her religious order with 6 sisters. Whatever arrangements existed in the church at that time, when it comes to men and women, Mother Cabrini was not disempowered. She was not crushed or discarded or made mute. In the world of which she was a part, Mother Cabrini had a place, and she had leverage, and she had men who were allies, all of which she used to further her vision and make her mark. In an age that's defined as patriarchal and crushing of the feminine spirit, this femme flourished in a way we can hardly imagine of anyone, male or female, today. Say what you want about the sexism of that time, but in our enlightened age, how many women founders of orphanages and hospitals and high schools and hospices, social service agencies, and wellness homes do we celebrate? Especially those who have done all these things apart from federal aid. And the answer is none. If you look at the bad old days of the religious sisters in the United States, beginning about 1820 and going to about 1950, how many colleges, universities, hospitals, and evangelical ministries were founded by Protestant women? And the answer is virtually none. How many were founded by Catholic women? Dozens upon dozens. We feel superior in our understanding, both about how things are today and what we think of things yesterday. But the truth of the matter is that what women did in days gone by, compared to today, deserves some reevaluation. This movie perhaps nudged the needle a little bit, but only a little. Mostly it falls into the rut of our presumptions and never leaves there. It's easy to leave the movie theater and not realize that her accomplishments had something to do with the structure of the society and the church at that time that ultimately aided her. It was not just her own grit and determination. So, all in all, the movie was okay. It's inspiring to see sisters celebrated for their insight and dedication. I think the Catholic Church comes across generally well, despite the obvious limitations of some of the characters involved. The Pope even comes across as a sympathetic character, although he has to say no to Mother time after time. And certainly it's a net positive when it comes to celebrating the history of the country that we can plug into the heroes of that day in line with the sensibilities and certainties of our age. Angel Studios seemed to know their audience, and they scored a big hit with Catholics and with the general movie-making public. I have one minor criticism and one major one. The first, the minor one, is that the movie has no interest in describing anything about the religious life of Mother Cabrini and her sisters. Mother was not simply a strong woman with progressive views. She was sustained by her sisters and worked in concert with them to achieve all her successes. In the movie, there is never a moment where they're praying or going to Mass or teaching the faith or inviting young women to serve Jesus. I know why. Such a thing would likely put the audience off. In our age, women praying together or reciting the Psalms or kneeling at the Sanctus would seem distancing or so foreign as to be disagreeable. We can rally behind women nailing up new walls in a disused building or embarrassing a bishop in his office. But praying would be troubling. So these elements are not part of the movie, which leads to my major criticism, which is this movie does nothing to tell us about Mother Cabrini. I mean, this entire movie and virtually all of its dialogue and much of its scenery could be made about Margaret Sanger, the vicious, racist, eugenicist founder of Planned Parenthood. All of the biting criticism of ecclesial authority and government interference, all of the withering obstructionism of the contemporary arrangement of the sexes, the bitter complacency of those who oppress one another, all of these scenes would fit into Margaret Sanger's life as much as Mother Cabrini's. Rather than talk of hospitals and orphanages, Sanger would speak of abortuaries and condoms. But the appeal to a greater humanity and services to those whom we identify comfortably as oppressed, they'd all be the same. The language used and the ideas expressed for Mother Cabrini in this film would be exactly the same for Margaret Sanger, which is why the movie is, in my estimation, a failure. We see nothing of the faith that impelled her, the community that sustained her, or the gospel that enlivened her. At the end of the movie, we're reminded that she was canonized as a saint, but only as a footnote. If we only watched the movie, we might be led to imagine her holiness was based on her willingness to kick in the doors rather than to serve the Lord. And unless we can find the latter in the former, all we're left with is shattered lumber rather than sure faithfulness. The Cabrini of the movie serves the Lord of this world, who occupies her rhetoric, rather than the Lord of heaven, who occupied the saint's true heart. As we leave the theater, we learn that being a saint is to be a headline for today's lead rather than a servant of yesterday's Lord. If watching the movie prompts you to read about Mother Cabrini's true life, then you've learned something, but only because of what you've read, not because of what you've seen. So go ahead and watch, but stay awake. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called The Old Man. I'm approaching 70, he said. I don't need to make a splash. The story of my life has become now more dot than dash. Craving for firm grounding, for notice in the brightness of the lights, have been replaced by the airy floating of balloons and kites. Held strongly and tethered still, tightly attached to terra firma, but dancing in the wind with no tragedy if rara perma. I don't need to know everyone's looking, hoping I'm seen. Let them look or look away. It's all the same now to me. When 40 or even younger, I confess it was not so. I was consumed by the hope the world might see and know. The preferred image of my life, the ideal picture of me. They would ooh and ah at the sum of all I was and could be. But desires are but the wind, never resting in the moment. They never slake or reward, but become the next component. So travel on, seek all the world's promise, shine in the world's light. Be seen and admired, allow the sparkling motes to gather right. Just remember, at the end of a decade or just a day, the admiration of the world, all its high thoughts pass away. And open to another world we can glimpse easily from here, beyond the boundaries of others' eyes, above the clouds, right near. That's The Old Man. In the weeks to come, I hope that we can together explore what it means to be living Catholic.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.